Disrespect can cost you your dignity, but for one flight attendant, it cost her everything. In the crowded terminal of a bustling international airport, a man in a simple grey sweater was about to board a flight he happened to own. He wasn't looking for special treatment, only the same basic courtesy afforded to any passenger. But when a senior flight attendant, blinded by prejudice and arrogance, decided he didn't belong, she made a catastrophic error. She took his boarding pass, tore it in half, and threw it away. She had no idea she had just sealed her own fate and thrown away her entire career with it. This is the story of how a single act of contempt triggered a chain reaction that reached the very top of the corporate ladder, proving that karma sometimes doesn't just knock, it kicks the door down. The air in Terminal 4 of JFK International Airport was a familiar symphony of chaos. The rolling thunder of suitcases on tile, the cacophony of final boarding calls for flights to distant cities, and the murmur of 1,000 different conversations blended into a single kinetic hum. Donovan Sterling stood slightly apart from the throng of passengers clustered around Gate B12. His presence, a study in quiet observation. Dressed in a pair of well-worn dark jeans, a simple unadorned charcoal grey cashmere sweater, and comfortable leather sneakers, he could have been anyone, a professor on his way to a conference, an architect visiting a new site, a son going home to visit his parents. Nothing about him screamed wealth or power, and that was precisely by design. Donovan preferred it this way. As the founder and majority shareholder of Sterling Vanguard Holdings, the private equity firm that had acquired Stellara Air 3 years prior, anonymity was his most valuable tool. He made it a point to fly commercial on his own airline at least once a quarter, always booking a premium economy seat under a slightly altered name. He didn't do it for the thrill of going undercover, but for the unvarnished truth. He wanted to see the cracks, the triumphs, the real unfiltered customer experience. He believed you couldn't truly understand a company from a boardroom on the 50th floor. You had to feel its pulse at the gate, in the jet bridge, and at 30,000 feet. Today's pulse was erratic. The flight to San Francisco was delayed by 45 minutes due to a late inbound aircraft, and the mood at the gate was growing tense. The gate agent, a young man named Robert, with a perpetually stressed expression, was doing his best to manage the flow of increasingly impatient passengers. Donovan approached the desk holding his phone, with the digital boarding pass displayed. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm and even. "I just wanted to confirm my seat assignment. It seems to have been unassigned in the app." Robert glanced at the phone, his fingers flying across his keyboard. "Name, Daniel Stone," Donovan replied, using his travel pseudonym. Robert typed, then frowned. "I'm sorry, sir, but your ticket has been flagged. There appears to be a payment authorization issue with the credit card used for the booking." Donovan felt a flicker of surprise, but kept his composure. He knew for a fact the corporate card used for these trips had an effectively unlimited ceiling and was in perfect standing. This was a system error, a small but significant crack in the customer service facade. "That seems unlikely," he said politely. "Could you please try running it again?" "It's a corporate account. There shouldn't be any issues." "Sir, the system says what it says," Robert said, his voice strained. He was clearly overwhelmed. "You'll have to step aside and call your bank. I have a full flight to board here." From the jet bridge entrance, a woman emerged with an air of imperious authority. She was a senior flight attendant, her uniform immaculate, her blonde hair pulled back into a severe chignon. Her name tag read Brenda. She surveyed the crowd with a look of weary disdain, her eyes eventually landing on Donovan. "What's the hold-up, Robert?" she asked, her tone sharp, cutting through the noise. "We need to start pre-boarding the Diamond Tier members." "This gentleman's ticket is flagged," Robert explained, gesturing vaguely toward Donovan. "Payment issue." Brenda's eyes swept over Donovan, taking in his simple attire. Her lips curled into a faint, dismissive sneer. It was a look he had seen before, the kind of snap judgment that categorized a person's worth in a single, sweeping glance. To her, he was a problem, a delay, a man dressed in unremarkable clothes who was likely trying to fly on a credit card he couldn't afford. "Well, he needs to sort it out somewhere else," Brenda declared, not even addressing Donovan directly. "We can't hold up the entire flight for one person's financial problems. Sir," she finally said, turning her cold gaze on him, "you are holding up the line. Please step aside. Now." Donovan held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I assure you the issue isn't on my end. It's a glitch in your system," he stated, his voice firm but still respectful. "If you could just take a moment to double-check." "We don't have a moment," Brenda snapped. She turned to Robert. "Re-release his seat into the system. If he gets his payment sorted before the doors close, and if there's still a seat available, he can get on. Otherwise, he can try the next flight." Robert looked torn, a brief flash of empathy crossing his face before being stamped out by Brenda's domineering presence. She was senior crew. Her word was law at the gate. He nodded reluctantly. "Yes, Brenda." Donovan didn't argue further. He simply nodded slowly, a deep sense of disappointment settling in his chest. He wasn't angry about the inconvenience. He was dismayed by the casual cruelty, the complete lack of empathy, or even basic problem-solving. This was the very culture he had been working to eradicate at Stellara Air. He stepped away from the desk, pulling out his phone. He wasn't calling his bank. He was sending a text message to Gregory Thorne, the CEO of Stellara Air. It was short and to the point. "On SA 788, JFK to SFO, or trying to be, experiencing a significant customer service failure at Gate B12. Will report in full later. Do not intervene yet. I want to see this play out." He put his phone away and stood back, watching as the Diamond Tier passengers were called forward, their briefcases and designer bags, a stark contrast to his own simple backpack. Brenda stood at the entrance to the jet bridge, greeting them with a smile that was as bright as it was artificial. A smile he noted that had been entirely absent just moments before. The quiet storm inside him began to brew. This flight was going to be far more illuminating than he had ever imagined. After a tense 15-minute phone call, not with a bank, but with his personal wealth manager, who confirmed with audible confusion that the corporate card was as liquid as the Pacific Ocean, Donovan approached the gate desk again. A different agent was now present, and the issue was resolved with a few keystrokes. It had been, as he suspected, a simple system communication error. He was handed a paper boarding pass for seat 18B, a middle seat in the premium economy cabin he had originally booked. He had been one of the last to board, and the disapproving glares from passengers eager for takeoff followed him down the aisle. As he found his row, he saw that the flight was nearly full. Stowing his backpack in the overhead compartment, he settled into his seat. The man by the window was engrossed in a spreadsheet on his laptop, and the woman on the aisle was already asleep, a silk eye mask covering her face. Donovan buckled his seatbelt and let out a slow breath, hoping the worst of the unpleasantness was behind him. That hope evaporated the moment Brenda Jensen made her way down the aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin. When her gaze fell upon Donovan, a flicker of annoyance crossed her face, as if his very presence was a personal affront. It was clear she had expected and perhaps hoped that he wouldn't make it onto the flight. The pre-departure service began. A younger flight attendant, her name tag reading Amelia, moved gracefully down the aisle, offering pre-departure beverages with a genuine smile. "Water, orange juice, or sparkling wine for you, sir?" she asked the man by the window. When she reached Donovan, her smile was just as warm. "And for you, sir. Just water, please." "Thank you, Amelia," Donovan replied, making a point to use her name. He saw her smile widen slightly, a small acknowledgement of being seen as a person, not just a uniform. Moments later, Brenda followed her role apparently to supervise and handle meal orders for the main service. She stopped at their row, her tablet in hand. She looked at the man by the window. "Mr. Peterson, will you be having the pan-seared chicken or the mushroom risotto for your meal?" "The chicken, please," he said, without looking up from his laptop. She then looked past Donovan directly at the sleeping woman on the aisle. "And for the lady," Amelia, who was nearby, interjected softly. "Brenda, we should probably wake her to get her order." Brenda waved a dismissive hand. "Don't be ridiculous. We'll just set a risotto aside for her. It's not that complicated." She looked back at her tablet, and then, with theatrical slowness, her eyes landed on Donovan. She didn't ask for his meal choice. Instead, she said, "I see you managed to sort out your little problem at the gate." Her tone was condescending, loud enough for the passengers in the surrounding rows to hear. Donovan felt a flush of heat rise in his neck, but he kept his voice level. "It was a system error on the airline side," he stated calmly. "As for my meal, I'll have the risotto, please." Brenda tapped her tablet with a long, red-painted fingernail. "The risotto is a popular choice. We'll have to see if there's enough. I'll put you down for it, but I can't make any promises." The implication was clear. He was last in line in every sense of the word. She moved on without another word. Donovan leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. This was no longer just poor service. It was a targeted campaign of passive aggression. He could feel the eyes of other passengers on him, some with pity, others with a hint of shared annoyance at the delay he had supposedly caused. Brenda had successfully painted him as a nuisance. An hour into the flight, the meal service began. Amelia served their row. She placed the chicken in front of the man by the window, and then turned to Donovan with an apologetic look. "Sir, I am so sorry," she said in a hushed voice. "It seems we've run out of the risotto. Brenda didn't allocate one for this row. All we have left is the chicken or a cheese and fruit plate." Donovan knew exactly what had happened. It was a petty but deliberate slight. He looked at Amelia, seeing the genuine regret in her eyes. She was an unfortunate subordinate to a toxic superior. "The cheese and fruit plate is perfectly fine," he said, giving her a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you for letting me know, Amelia. It's not your fault." She seemed to relax, grateful for his understanding. But as she walked away, Brenda passed by, and Donovan overheard her whisper to the younger attendant. "See, people like that are happy with whatever scraps they get. Don't waste your sympathy." The words struck Donovan with a force that surprised him. "People like that." The phrase was loaded, poisoned with prejudice. It wasn't just about his clothes or the payment issue anymore. It was about who she perceived him to be, someone lesser, someone undeserving. He ate his cheese and crackers in silence, his mind working. This was no longer a simple data point for a corporate report. This was a rot that could poison an entire company culture if left unchecked. He had seen enough. Now he needed to gauge the depth of it. He needed to see how far Brenda would go when challenged directly. He waited, biding his time, knowing that a confrontation was now inevitable. The escalation was no longer just a possibility. It had become a necessity. He would give Brenda Jensen all the rope she needed, and he had a sinking feeling she would use every last inch of it. The drone of the engines was a hypnotic constant as the aircraft cruised high above the American heartland. For the next 2 hours, Donovan remained quiet, observing. He watched Brenda interact with other passengers in the front of the cabin, her demeanor transforming into one of saccharine charm. She laughed at a businessman's joke, offered an extra pillow to a woman with a perfectly coiffed haircut, and refilled wine glasses with a flourish. It was a masterful performance, a stark and calculated contrast to the contempt she reserved for him. He watched Amelia too. He saw her diligently checking on passengers, her kindness seemingly universal and unconditional. At one point, she noticed Donovan's empty water bottle and without being asked brought him a new one. "It's important to stay hydrated," she said with her simple, earnest smile. It was a small gesture, but in the context of the flight it felt monumental. It was a flicker of the service culture he envisioned for Stellara Air. Donovan knew he needed to create a pretext for one final interaction. He needed a scenario that required Brenda to engage with him directly, one where she couldn't simply ignore him or pass him off to her junior colleague. An idea began to form. He pressed the call button above his head. A few moments later, it was Amelia who responded, arriving with a questioning look. "Yes, sir. Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine, thank you, Amelia," Donovan said kindly. "But I would like to speak with the senior flight attendant, please." "Brenda." Amelia's professional smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. I'll get her for you." She turned and walked toward the galley. Donovan could see them talking near the curtain. Brenda shot a venomous glare down the aisle in his direction before reluctantly making her way toward him. She stood over his seat, her arms crossed, her posture radiating impatience. She didn't speak, simply raising her eyebrows in a silent, insolent, "What? Thank you for coming." Donovan began, his voice low and even, forcing her to lean in slightly to hear him over the engine noise. "I have a question about my ticket. When I was reissued my boarding pass at the gate, I believe there was an error. I am a Platinum Elite member with your loyalty program, and my booking class should have made me eligible for a complimentary upgrade to business class if a seat was available. I noticed several empty seats in that cabin as I boarded." He was, of course, a Platinum Elite member, though he rarely used the perks on these observational trips. But he knew for a fact that his original booking code entitled him to that upgrade, and he also knew that at least 2 seats 1A and 4C had been empty. Brenda's expression soured completely. It was as if he had accused her of a crime. "Sir," she said, her voice dripping with disbelief. "Upgrades are processed at the gate based on status and availability. If you weren't upgraded, it's because you weren't eligible or there were no seats." "I understand the process," Donovan countered calmly. "However, the system at the gate was clearly having issues, as we established earlier. I'm asking if you could please verify my status and check the manifest for any available seats now." A man in the row ahead turned to glance back at them, intrigued by the quiet but intense exchange. Brenda let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Verify your status here now, sir. We are in the middle of a flight. I am not a gate agent, and frankly—" She lowered her voice to a conspiratorial, insulting hiss. "Looking at you, I highly doubt you hold any kind of elite status with this airline. People who earn that kind of status don't typically have payment issues with their tickets." The personal insult was sharp and deliberate. This was the moment. "I can assure you I do," Donovan said, maintaining his infuriating calm. "My boarding pass has my frequent flyer number on it. Perhaps you could take a look." He reached into his sweater pocket and pulled out the flimsy paper boarding pass he had been issued at the gate. He held it out to her. This was the final straw for Brenda. Her professional facade, already cracked, shattered completely. In her mind, this man, this poorly dressed, problematic passenger, was not only questioning her authority, but was now lying to her face about his status, trying to scam his way into a better seat. Her accumulated frustration and prejudice boiled over into an act of pure, unadulterated hubris. She snatched the boarding pass from his hand. She didn't even glance at it. Her eyes, cold and filled with a strange, triumphant foe, were locked on his. "You know what I think of your boarding pass." She spat, her voice a low, vicious snarl. And then she did the unthinkable. With two sharp, decisive motions, she ripped the boarding pass in half, and then in half again. The sound was small, but shockingly violent in the confines of the cabin. Several nearby passengers gasped. The man in the window seat next to Donovan froze his fingers, hovering over his keyboard, his eyes wide with disbelief. Amelia, who had been watching from the aisle, brought a hand to her mouth, her face pale. Brenda dropped the 4 small squares of paper into her hand. "There," she sneered, her voice now back to a normal, chillingly casual volume. "Problem solved. You don't have a boarding pass anymore. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have actual work to do. Do not press that call button again." She turned on her heel and walked away, a smug, self-satisfied smirk on her face. She believed she had won. She believed she had put the troublesome passenger in his place, asserting her dominance once and for all. Donovan Sterling did not react. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't protest. He simply watched her go, a profound and unnerving stillness settling over him. He looked at the shocked faces of his fellow passengers, then at the horrified expression on Amelia's. He gave the young flight attendant a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message that said, "It's okay. You saw it." Then he reached into his pocket and retrieved his phone. He switched it off airplane mode. He knew the in-flight Wi-Fi was one of the best in the industry. He had personally overseen the multi-million-dollar investment in the technology. He opened his contacts, his thumb hovering for a moment over a name. Brenda Jensen had not just ripped up a piece of paper. She had ripped up the final page of her career. She had crossed a line from which there was no retreat. She had reached the point of no return, and she had no idea what was waiting for her on the other side. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The low hum of the engines remained, but it was now underscored by a palpable tension. Passengers who had witnessed the incident exchanged uneasy glances, whispering behind their hands. Brenda Jensen, meanwhile, had retreated to the galley, feigning an intense interest in organizing beverage carts. She was avoiding the aisle, avoiding the dozens of pairs of eyes that now followed her every move. In her mind, she had handled a difficult situation. The passenger was silenced. Her authority was reasserted. The matter was closed. In seat 18B, Donovan Sterling was perfectly still. He navigated to his secure messaging app, the one he used for communicating with the highest echelons of his company. The recipient was already selected, Gregory Thorne, CEO of Stellara Air. The message was delivered instantly via the satellite Wi-Fi. "Donovan. Gregory, change of plans. I need you to be on the ground at SFO when we land. The situation has escalated to a level 1 incident. An employee, senior flight attendant, Brenda Jensen, has committed an act of gross misconduct, including the deliberate destruction of a passenger's boarding document mid-flight." A few thousand miles away, in a corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline, Gregory Thorne's phone chimed. He read the message, and his blood ran cold. Donovan Sterling never used terms like level 1 incident. His reports were typically calm, collected observations about catering quality or the cleanliness of the lavatories. This was unprecedented. Gregory's fingers flew across the screen. "Thorne, understood, Donovan. I'm booking a seat on our next flight out of O'Hare. I'll be there. What do you need?" Donovan: "Have the head of airport operations corporate security and a senior HR representative meet me at the jet bridge upon arrival. No sirens, no scene. I want them discreet. I also need the full unedited personnel file for Brenda Jensen sent to my secure email within the next 10 minutes. And alert the captain. Tell him he has a code Sierra passenger on board and to proceed directly to the designated gate without delay upon landing. No further details." Code Sierra was a designation they had created for Sterling himself. It meant Sterling Incident Active Requiring Response and gave him overriding authority on any company asset, including an aircraft in flight. Thorne: "Done. Is there a threat to the aircraft?" Donovan: "The only threat was to the integrity of this company. That threat has been neutralized. I will handle the deplaning." Donovan closed the app and turned his phone off, placing it back in his pocket. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes, appearing for all intents and purposes to be resting. But behind his closed eyelids, his mind was a whirlwind of disappointment and resolve. The sheer arrogance of the act was staggering. Destroying a boarding pass was not just rude. It was a symbolic act of stripping a customer of their legitimacy of saying, "You do not belong here." It was the culmination of every sneer, every condescending word, every dismissive gesture. Up in the galley, Amelia approached Brenda, her hands trembling slightly. "Brenda, what you did, you can't do that. You can't just rip up someone's ticket." Brenda scoffed, not even looking at her, as she wiped down a clean counter. "Oh, calm down, rookie. It was a piece of paper. The guy is a troublemaker. I've been doing this for 15 years. I know how to handle his type. You need to develop a thicker skin if you're going to last in this job." "But what if he complains? What if he what?" Brenda cut her off, finally turning to face her, her eyes blazing with defiance. "He'll file a complaint. I'll say he was being aggressive and that his boarding pass was crumpled and fell apart in my hand. It'll be his word against mine. And whose word do you think management is going to take? A 15-year veteran, or some nobody in a cheap sweater who couldn't even pay for his ticket properly?" The cockpit door opened, and the first officer emerged, walking purposefully toward the main galley. "Brenda, the captain needs to see you." Brenda's smug expression faltered for a second. "Now we're preparing for descent." "He said it's immediate," the first officer replied, his face an unreadable mask. A flicker of unease finally penetrated Brenda's armor of self-righteousness. She straightened her uniform and walked toward the cockpit, disappearing inside. She was in there for less than 2 minutes. When she came out, her face was ashen. The smugness was gone, replaced by a dawning, sickening horror. The captain had not yelled. He had been terrifyingly calm. He had informed her that upon receiving a message from the highest level of corporate command, he was to instruct her that her duties for the remainder of the flight were terminated. She was to remain seated in a jump seat and not interact with any passengers or crew. All of her authority was revoked, effective immediately. He didn't tell her why. He didn't have to. As she stumbled back toward the galley, her eyes darted down the aisle and found Donovan Sterling sitting placidly in seat 18B. His eyes were now open, and they met hers across the length of the cabin. In that single silent moment of eye contact, the entire world shifted under Brenda Jensen's feet. The neat, orderly hierarchy she had understood for 15 years where she was the authority, and he was the nobody crumbled into dust. She didn't know who he was, but she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she had just made the single greatest mistake of her life. The man in the cheap sweater was not a nobody. He was somebody. Somebody who could end her career with a single text message. She sank into the nearest jump seat, her legs suddenly unable to support her. The cabin began its initial descent into San Francisco, and for Brenda, it felt like she was falling into an abyss. The unveiling was complete. The mask was off, not just hers but his. And the face of the man she had tormented was, she was beginning to realize with terror, the face of the man who held her entire future in his hands. The aircraft's wheels touched down on the runway at San Francisco International Airport. With a gentle squeal, the reverse thrusters roaring to life. For most passengers, it was the familiar end to a long journey. For Brenda Jensen, it was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. Every bump and squeak of the plane as it taxied toward the gate was a tick of the clock counting down the last moments of her professional life. She remained strapped into the jump seat near the rear galley, her face a pale mask of dread. Amelia and the other flight attendants performed their landing duties in a tense, surreal silence. The captain's voice came over the intercom, but it was different from the usual cheerful arrival announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. We ask that you please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate and the seatbelt sign has been turned off. For security reasons, we will be deplaning in a slightly different order today. Please await instructions from the crew." This unusual announcement sent a ripple of confusion through the cabin. As the plane docked with the jet bridge, the customary scramble for overhead bins was arrested by the flight attendants' firm, but polite requests for everyone to stay seated. Then the main cabin door opened. But instead of the usual gate agent, 3 figures stepped onto the aircraft. The first was a tall, stern-looking man in a dark suit, his lapel pin identifying him as Airport Operations Director. The second was a woman in sharp corporate attire, her face grim and professional. Harriet Finch, the regional head of human resources. The third was a broad-shouldered man, whose suit did little to hide his muscular frame, a member of Stellara Air's corporate security team. They didn't look at the passengers. Their eyes scanned the cabin until they found Donovan Sterling, who was now standing up from seat 18B. The operations director gave a slight, respectful nod. "Ms. Sterling, we're here as requested." A collective gasp went through the cabin. The name Sterling hung in the air, connecting instantly and shockingly with the name of the airline's parent company, Sterling Vanguard Holdings. The man in the grey sweater. The man whose ticket was declined. The man whose boarding pass was torn to pieces. Mr. Sterling, the owner. The puzzle pieces clicked into place. For every passenger who had witnessed the drama, their faces a mixture of astonishment and dawning comprehension. The businessman in the row ahead looked as if he'd seen a ghost. The woman on the aisle, now wide awake, stared openly, her jaw slack. Donovan addressed the stunned cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying a calm authority that needed no amplification. "My name is Donovan Sterling. I apologize for this unusual delay. There was a serious customer service and safety incident on this flight that required immediate attention. We will have you on your way in just a few moments." He then turned his attention to the back of the plane. His gaze was cold and hard as it landed on Brenda, who seemed to shrink under the weight of it. "Ms. Finch," he said to the HR head. "Flight attendant Brenda Jensen is to be escorted off the aircraft. Her company credentials and security access are to be revoked immediately. She is to be placed on indefinite administrative leave pending a full investigation, which I expect to be concluded by tomorrow morning." Harriet Finch nodded. "Understood, Mr. Sterling." She and the security officer began to walk down the aisle. The passengers parted for them as if they were royalty, their heads turning to watch the slow-motion car crash of Brenda's career. As Miss Finch reached her, she spoke in a low, unwavering tone. "Brenda, please come with us." Brenda looked up, her face a mess of panic and disbelief. "But it was a misunderstanding," she stammered, her voice cracking. I thought." "What you thought is no longer relevant," Miss Finch said, her voice devoid of sympathy. "What you did is. Now please, let's not make this more of a spectacle than it already is." The security officer stood silently beside her, an imposing presence that left no room for argument. Defeated, Brenda unbuckled herself. As she was led up the aisle, she had to walk directly past Donovan's row. She refused to look at him, her eyes fixed on the floor, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. But it wasn't a tear of remorse. It was a tear of self-pity, of a reality she couldn't escape. She had flown this route 1,000 times, always walking off the plane with her head held high. Today she was being walked off in disgrace, a pariah, in the uniform she once wore with such arrogance. Once she was off the plane, Donovan turned to Amelia, who was standing near the galley, looking shaken but resolute. "Amelia," he said, and her head snapped up. "You conducted yourself with professionalism and kindness under difficult circumstances. You represent the true values of this airline. I want you to write a full and honest statement about everything you witnessed today. Don't leave anything out." "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I will." "Good," Donovan nodded. He then addressed the rest of the passengers. "You may now deplane. Thank you for your patience and for flying with Stellara Air." As the passengers finally began to gather their belongings, a new buzz filled the cabin. They weren't just talking about the delay anymore. They were talking about the quiet man in the grey sweater who owned the airline, about the flight attendant who sealed her fate with a sneer and a tear. They were witnesses to a rare and stunning display of justice, delivered not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but at 30,000 feet, culminating in a final decisive grounding at the gate. The story of Flight SA-788 was already becoming a legend. The fallout from Flight SA-788 was not swift, it was instantaneous and brutal. For Brenda Jensen, the walk down the jet bridge, flanked by HR and security, was a walk of shame that led not to the terminal, but to a sterile, windowless room in the airport's administrative wing. There she was, formally notified of her suspension, and asked to surrender her company ID, her airport access card, and the keys to her crew locker. The process was cold, efficient, and utterly impersonal. The vast corporate machinery she had once been a proud cog in had turned against her, and it was grinding her up with terrifying speed. Her formal interview with Harriet Finch and a Stellara Air corporate lawyer took place the next morning. Brenda arrived with her union representative, clinging to the hope that her 15 years of service would count for something, that the union could paint this as a he said, she said situation. That hope was systematically dismantled piece by piece. "Miss Jensen," Harriet Finch began, her tone glacial, "we have reviewed the preliminary report regarding the events on yesterday's flight. Let's start with the incident at the gate." Brenda, coached by her rep, began to spin her tale. "The passenger was causing a disturbance over a payment issue. He was being belligerent and holding up the boarding process. I simply intervened to maintain order and ensure an on-time departure." Ms. Finch slid a printed document across the table. This is the signed statement from the gate agent, Robert Miller. He states that the passenger, Mr. Sterling, was calm and polite, and that you were the one who was dismissive and aggressive, ordering him to offload the passenger without attempting to resolve the issue. Brenda's face paled. Well, he's just a junior agent. He was probably intimidated. Ms. Finch picked up another stack of papers. We then have the issue of the meal service. You claim the passenger received the cheese plate because the risotto had run out, a common occurrence. That's correct, Brenda said a little too quickly. Interesting, Ms. Finch countered, because we have a statement from Flight Attendant Amelia Vance, who reports that you deliberately failed to provision a risotto for seat 18B, and later told her and I, quote, people like that are happy with whatever scraps they get. Do you deny saying that? She's young. She misheard me. Brenda stammered, her eyes darting toward her rep, who was looking increasingly grim. And finally, Ms. Finch said, her voice dropping, we come to the matter of the boarding pass. You claim it was crumpled and fell apart in your hand. Yes, it was in poor condition, Brenda insisted, her voice trembling. Ms. Finch leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Brenda's. Ms. Jensen, we have official sworn statements from no fewer than 7 other passengers in the surrounding rows. They include a senior partner at Deloitte, a neurosurgeon from UCSF Medical Center, and a federal judge. All 7 state unequivocally that you snatched the boarding pass from Mr. Sterling's hand and deliberately and violently ripped it into 4 pieces. Their accounts are perfectly consistent with each other and with the account of Ms. Vance. The union rep cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The wall of evidence was insurmountable. But the reckoning didn't stop there. As per Donovan's instructions, HR had done a deep dive into Brenda's entire 15-year service record. What they found was a pattern. On their own, the complaints were minor annoyances that had been explained away or dismissed. A complaint in 2018 about her being rude and dismissive to a non-English-speaking family. Another in 2021 about her refusing to help a passenger with their carry-on bag, telling them it was not her job. A third from just 6 months ago about a racially charged joke she made to a fellow crew member, which was overheard by a passenger. Individually, they were small cracks, but laid out on the table in front of her, they formed a road map of her arrogance and prejudice, a long history of a toxic employee who had been allowed to fester within the system for far too long. The incident with Donovan Sterling wasn't an aberration. It was the inevitable culmination of her behavior. The tearing of the boarding pass. Ms. Finch concluded her voice, leaving no room for negotiation. Constitutes not only a violation of company policy, but also of federal aviation regulations regarding passenger documentation. It is an act of gross misconduct. Combined with your documented history of passenger mistreatment and your dishonesty during this investigation, Stellara Air is left with no choice. Your employment is terminated effective immediately. The finality of the words hit Brenda like a physical blow. Terminated. After 15 years, my pension. Your actions have voided the good standing clauses of your employment contract, the lawyer interjected smoothly. You will be ineligible for severance pay, and the company's contributions to your pension plan are forfeited as per the gross misconduct policies you signed upon your hiring. You will receive only your own base contributions. It was a complete and utter professional and financial devastation. She was not just fired, she was erased. Furthermore, the incident was placed on a permanent record, shared among major air carriers. She was, for all intents and purposes, blacklisted from the industry. No other major airline would touch her. The karma was, as Donovan had intended, hard and unrelenting. Her arrogance had cost her not just a job, but a career. Her prejudice had cost her not just her reputation, but her financial security. She had judged a man by his simple sweater, and in doing so had unraveled the entire fabric of her life. As she walked out of the corporate office, stripped of her wings and her dignity, the full weight of her reckoning finally crushed her. She had thrown away a passenger's ticket, and in return, the universe in the form of Donovan Sterling had thrown her away. In the weeks that followed, the grounding of Brenda Jensen, the story of Flight SA788, was no longer just a whisper in the galleys. It had become a foundational myth within the airline. It was dissected, debated and retold with varying degrees of accuracy in crew lounges from Honolulu to Boston. Initially, the narrative was one of fear. Employees walked on eggshells, suddenly terrified that any passenger in simple clothing could be a corporate titan in disguise, ready to bring down the axe for the slightest infraction. The name Donovan Sterling became a bogeyman, a symbol of a terrifying new level of scrutiny. But that interpretation Donovan knew was a dangerous one. Fear was a terrible motivator. It bred resentment and robotic, insincere service. He needed to transform the cautionary tale into an inspirational one. His mission began not in a boardroom, but in a quiet conversation with his CEO, Gregory Thorne, 2 days after the incident. "They're afraid, Gregory," Donovan said, looking out his office window at the distant silver glint of an airplane. "I'm hearing chatter that crews are terrified. That's not the goal. Brenda Jensen was not the disease. She was a symptom, a manifestation of a cultural sickness we allowed to grow in the dark. The disease is complacency. It's the quiet belief that seniority grants a license for contempt. It's the laziness of judging a person by their clothes instead of the content of their character. Firing her was like cutting out a tumor, but now we have to treat the whole patient with aggressive, sustained therapy. I don't want an airline of fearful employees. I want an airline of proud ambassadors." This philosophy was the bedrock of what came next. His first tangible action was a phone call that would change a young woman's life. Amelia Vance was at home, still shaken by the events, and preparing her official statement when her personal cell phone rang with an unknown number. Hesitantly, she answered. "Amelia, this is Donovan Sterling." Her breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Sterling." "Sir, I was just writing up my report. I've already read your preliminary one." "Amelia," he said, his voice warm and reassuring. "It was honest and clear. That's why I'm calling. I'm creating a new position at this company, and I want you to be the first person to hold the title In-Flight Service Culture Ambassador." Silence. Amelia was certain she had misheard. "Ambassador, sir, I'm just a junior flight attendant. I've only been flying for 2 years. I'm not qualified. You are more qualified than anyone I can think of," Donovan countered gently. "I don't need a corporate trainer who knows how to make a PowerPoint presentation. I need someone who understands in their bones what dignity and kindness look like at 30,000 feet. Especially when it's hard. I saw it in your eyes on that flight. You weren't just being polite. You were being genuinely kind. You didn't just see a difficult passenger. You saw a human being. That is the only qualification that matters. I want you to help us build a new training program. I want you to fly with our crews, mentor them, and be the living example of the standard we now expect." He paused. "The job is yours if you want it." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes. It was an overwhelming, terrifying, and exhilarating opportunity. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want it." Donovan's next stop was the boardroom, and there he met resistance. When he laid out the plan for the Sterling Standard, a mandatory company-wide 2-day training overhaul, the chief financial officer, a man named Arthur Vance, cleared his throat ominously. "Donovan," Arthur began, gesturing to a spreadsheet on his laptop. "I've run the preliminary numbers on this, taking every one of our 50,000 employees offline for 2 days of training, plus the cost of developing the curriculum and hiring facilitators. You're talking about a one-time expenditure in the tens of millions of dollars. From a purely fiscal perspective, it's an enormous hit for a soft initiative." Donovan turned his gaze to Arthur, his expression unyielding. "Arthur, what's the cost of a ruined reputation? What is the dollar value of the video that a passenger didn't take of Brenda's meltdown because I was there to handle it? What is the price of the next Brenda Jensen, the one who doesn't do it to the owner of the airline, but to a grandmother or a soldier coming home or a family on their first vacation? An act like that goes viral in 30 seconds, and it can poison a brand for a decade." He stood up and walked to the head of the table. "You see this as an expense. I see it as the most critical investment we will ever make. We invest in new planes for safety and efficiency. We invest in marketing to make promises to our customers. Now we are going to invest in our people to ensure we can keep those promises. The Sterling Standard isn't soft. It's the new backbone of this company. It's non-negotiable." The debate was over. The program rolled out with astonishing speed. Amelia, working with a team from HR, helped design modules that were brutally realistic. They moved beyond smiling and politeness. One role-playing exercise, which became known as the middle seat, involved a trainee having to manage 3 simulated passengers at once, one who was terrified of flying, one who had been mistakenly served a meal with an allergen, and one who was being passive-aggressive about armrest space. The goal was not to solve every problem instantly, but to make each person feel heard, respected, and cared for amidst the chaos. To reinforce the training, Donovan established the Compass Awards, a quarterly recognition program. The first award didn't go to a pilot or flight attendant, but to a baggage handler in Denver named Paul. During a snowstorm that had stranded hundreds, Paul had noticed a young couple with a baby who had run out of diapers and formula. On his own break, he drove to a nearby 24-hour store and bought them supplies with his own money. Someone posted the story on social media. Donovan flew Paul and his family to Chicago, presented him with a $10,000 check and extra vacation time in front of the entire executive team, and made his story the centerpiece of the company's next internal newsletter. The message was clear. Character and compassion were now the fastest way to the top. Donovan himself changed. He began hosting his town halls in crew lounges, sitting on a rolling suitcase instead of standing at a podium. He listened as pilots complained about inefficient scheduling software, and gate agents pleaded for better communication during delays. He didn't just listen. He took notes, and employees began to see real changes based on their feedback. He was no longer an invisible owner. He was an engaged leader. 6 months after the incident, Donovan found himself at JFK's Terminal 4, standing once more near Gate B12. He was flying to London, and he had booked his ticket under his own name. The gate agent, a woman he didn't recognize, looked at his boarding pass, and then up at him, a flicker of professional recognition in her eyes. "Welcome, Mr. Sterling," she said, with a calm, genuine smile. "We're honored to have you with us today. We'll be starting the boarding process in just a few minutes." There was no fawning, no panic, just quiet, efficient respect. It was the culture he had envisioned. As he stepped onto the plane, he was greeted by Amelia Vance. She was flying to London to kick off the European crew training for the Sterling standard. Her confidence and poise were a world away from the nervous junior attendant he had met months earlier. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her smile lighting up her face. "Welcome aboard. It's so good to see you." "The pleasure is all mine, Amelia," he replied, shaking her hand. "You're doing incredible work. I'm already seeing the difference." "It's the people, sir," she said. "You gave them permission to be their best selves." She then shared a quick story about a flight crew who had learned a few phrases of sign language to surprise a deaf passenger on her birthday. He settled into his seat, the cabin buzzing with a calm, professional energy. He knew the work was never truly finished. A corporate culture was not a machine you could fix, but a garden that needed constant tending. But as he looked at the proud, smiling crew of Stellara Air, he knew that the seeds of respect, dignity, and kindness had been planted. The bitterness of Flight SA-788 had been the harsh fertilizer that allowed this new, vibrant culture to grow. The plane pushed back from the gate, soaring into the sky, and Donovan Sterling, owner and passenger, knew with absolute certainty that his airline was finally flying in the right direction. That single shocking act of tearing a boarding pass did more than just end a career. It exposed a deep flaw, and in the end redefined an entire airline. Donovan Sterling's story serves as a powerful, real-world lesson in humility and the hidden power dynamics of our world. It's a stark reminder that the person you look down on today could be the one who determines your tomorrow. The story of Brenda Jensen is a cautionary tale about how arrogance and prejudice can lead to a swift and brutal reckoning, proving that karma can indeed have a long memory and a heavy hand. If this story of dramatic justice resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more incredible, true stories of when entitlement meets its match. What did you think of Brenda's actions? Let us know in the comments below.